There are two words on which my lecture will be based, that is Tolkien's Lancelot, constitutes such a promising encounter that it will be a hard task to live up to it. On one hand, we have the most famous and most important fantasy writer of the 20th century, whose influence on the revival of medievalist fiction, that is, fiction set in a realist or fantasy world inspired by elements of our medieval culture, so whose influence on that revival has been paramount. On the other hand, we have a knight who is probably the most famous fiction knight in Western culture. I might say that because I'm French. We'll see that later. And who generally embodies the two main aspects of chivalry: outstanding military feats, often against the odds, and absolute faithfulness and dedication in a love relationship with the noblest woman possible. The encounter, still massively unknown today, has finally been offered to the general public about 10 years ago, as Mark said, which is a very short time for research and corresponds to about 2 hours in Oxford time. For all these reasons, when I considered what I would discuss in this lecture, the third canto of The Fall of Arthur, which had haunted my imagination for a few months, emerged as an obvious choice. If a few characters in Tolkien's legendarium have been compared to Lancelot by some scholars, sometimes a bit excessively in my opinion, such as Beren or Aragorn, The Fall of Arthur, and especially its third canto, is indeed the only original text written by Tolkien that stages Lancelot's character. It is, I think, important to remind everyone of a few things regarding The Fall of Arthur, as it is quite rarely read, if only because it was published quite recently for the first time. Tolkien's interest in the matter of Britain is well known and has been profusely commented upon by prominent scholars, mainly for two reasons. First, out of biographical interest, as Tolkien's teaching and academic work has focused, among other things, on Arthurian texts. Second, in a context of source criticism, that is, the retracing of all the medieval influences on Tolkien's most famous and studied works, Lord of the Rings, Hobbit, Silmarillion. What is less known is that Tolkien did not only use some elements of Arthurian text as an inspiration for his own fiction, but also translated one of these texts, Sir Gawain and the Green Knight, and started, without finishing it, to write a new version of the famous episode generally known as The Death of Arthur, which has been one of the most popular, hence one of the most rewritten, narratives of the matter of Britain from the 12th to the 15th century. It is this unfinished, yet fascinating text that I want to explore today by tackling its most interesting character, Lancelot. I started this paper by underlining that the encounter between Tolkien and Lancelot's character could only be promising, and would lead many to expect some dazzling sword fights and astonishing feats. I personally think that it fulfills all its promises, but not in the least in the way we could have imagined. Lancelot never fights, nor seems on the verge of doing it in the text we have, and even in Tolkien's notes on what would have followed. He is very different from the Lancelot we are used to, and is actually, in my opinion, one of the most complex literary versions of this character, and arguably the most original among all the different deaths of Arthur that we know, in that he opens the way to a reunion of different fictional worlds interconnected by Tolkien's one and only craft. So I'll try and tackle this question in a very classical 3 points program, as you can see. And I'll start immediately by studying Lancelot's evolution in the different deaths of Arthur. So it will be the medieval, maybe boring part for those who are not, for those who are here rather because of Tolkien and not of Lancelot. So I'd like to remind you of the main versions of the death of Arthur, which is in the first, the narrative of the death of Arthur is already in the first narrative about Arthur, which is Geoffrey of Monmouth, History of the Kings of Britain in Latin. And it is written about 1136. Do you say that? Yeah. You have a weird way of, saying years in English. So Geoffrey writes in Latin, and it retraces the whole history of Britain. So Arthur is only a small character in the whole book. But after that, some people thought, well, that's quite a good story. We should make more of it. And it started with someone called Vass, who was Anglo-Norman, and who wrote the novel of Brut, the Roman de Brut. But I won't tackle him today because he's not in the versions that have inspired Tolkien, really. The next one in this line is Layamon, who writes after Wace's Roman de Brut, but he rewrites that in English. And that's very important because he writes it in an English particularly devoid of Anglo-Norman vocabulary. There is, I've read, less than 150 words derived from French in the whole book, which is very little, especially in the 12th century. And that is at the end of the 12th century. Then we have a perfectly French book, The Mort Arthur, written after Chrétien de Troyes versus novels, who comes back to a chronicle-like narrative because Chrétien invented Lancelot. I will come back to that, and invented the idea that the Arthurian world was a cyclic world, a stationary world where adventures happen, but nothing moves on. Time is kind of frozen in Chrétien de Troyes. And the Mort Arthur is very important because it brings a world that comes to its end after the quest of the Holy Grail. Then we have two versions from unknown writers of the death of Arthur, which is the stanzaic Mort Arthur and the alliterative Mort Arthur, both written in the 14th century, towards the end for the alliterative. And so obviously stanzaic and alliterative just refers to the way they're written. It's not their title. The stanzaic, but very different, so it's important to bear that in mind. The stanzaic is basically a translation of the French novel. So there's a rivalry. You might know that there's a rivalry between France and England. And at that time, they decided they would like to have the story in English rather than in French, even if all the noblemen and women speak French, obviously. So it's what we call the translatio studi, bringing back the knowledge and the craft. So that's the stanzaic Mort Arthur, but it's very, very close to the French Mort Arthur. Then we have the alliterative Mort Arthur, and that is going back to Layamon and to Geoffrey. So it's a very different tendency. The author goes back to the chronicle and draws mainly on, as I said, Geoffrey and Layamon, removes a lot of romance-like elements, and diminishes considerably Lancelot's role. Then we have Malory, probably the best known for most of you. Malory is basically everything put together, because he's the last one. So he's read about everything that I've mentioned, and he writes with all that under his eyes. So he gathers all the different episodes from the chronicle tradition, even Tristram's story, Lancelot and Guinevere, everything, and then the death of Arthur, which gave his book the name The Mort d'Arthur. So after this very tiresome recap of all the known versions of the death of Arthur, I'd like to go to tackle Lancelot's apparition in that. So there are two main tendencies, as I started to underline. You could say there's an English one and a French one, but it's not entirely relevant, especially as Tolkien hated everything related to being French, but used quite a lot of so-called French elements. So the two main tendencies. One is rather the chronicle one and the English one. In this one, Gawain is the most important knight by far, and after Arthur himself, but Arthur is always above the others. Gawain is already present in the first versions, in Geoffrey, in Layamon, in Vastu. So he's already present as the king's nephew, and not only the king's nephew, but the king's sister's son, to speak like an Anglo-Saxon. That is the relationship between uncle and nephew on the mother's side, the most important link in Anglo-Saxon tradition. I send you back to Theoden and Eomer in The Lord of the Rings. On the other hand, we have Lancelot, who is a French invention. He appears with Chrétien, so not someone who wrote about the death of Arthur. Chrétien invents kind of courtly love. I mean, he makes a definition of courtly love. And Lancelot embodies the requirements of courtly love and the complete devotion to one's lady, even if it includes ridicule. And I'd like to just to bring some amusement by the episode of the cart. So if some of you who have read Chrétien de Troyes, Lancelot, or the Knight of the Cart, which is not a very nice name for for a knight, compared to Iwan, who is the Knight of the Lion. So Lancelot is trying to get back to Meleagant, who has abducted the queen, but he has lost his horse. But he has to, to go on. So he accepts to be led in a cart by a dwarf. So I think in medieval times you couldn't be more ashamed. But Lancelot accepts, even if he's a knight, because he wants to get back his lady. But he hesitates in Chrétien de Troyes' version, and the queen will be mad at him because he did hesitate to compromise his honor completely out of love. So that's the kind of requirement of courtly love. It's not something you mess about. But what is important is that Lancelot is not a war leader, unlike Gawain. Gawain is here to lead Arthur's army. He's a kind of constable, a medieval constable or general in chief. And Lancelot, on the other hand, is known for his individual adventures, like this kind of adventures or walking a bridge that is actually a sword, not easy either. So Lancelot is not a war leader originally. He'll become at some point, but that's quite late, and especially in the Moratu, and it's because he is not anymore on the side of Arthur. Otherwise, he is always under Arthur's commandment and generally under Gawain's commandment if they're both here. So we can draw a clear line between, on one side, a tradition, so as I said, mostly influenced by the chronicle model, and which is quite generally demonstrative in its revendication of an anglicized matter of Britain, and which has no or little interest in Lancelot. Coming to this very boring table, again, I promise there will be more funny slides after that. The existence of Lancelot, as I said, arrives in the death of Arthur with the Mort Arthur. And as we can see, the alliterative Mort Arthur, who mainly draws on Geoffrey and Layamon, decides to make Lancelot a very minor character. He's just one of the many knights, not at all like Gawain. And it's only the French-inspired tradition with the Mort Arthur, the stanzaic, and then Malory, that makes an important character out of Lancelot. And so we have on one side this tradition, and on the other, as I said, the French tradition, where Lancelot plays a major part and is not Gawain, the best knight in the world, only bettered sometimes by his perfectly pure but rather boring son, Galahad. Whereas in the Mort Arthur, Gawain is a sinful knight, and that is also important because he is guilty of tearing the Arthurian world apart, not Lancelot. So, no, that's too early, sorry. Going to the death of Arthur, because probably some of you don't know how Arthur dies. So I'll just tell you quite quickly. The main elements in the narrative of the death of Arthur is that Arthur is away from Britain with his army, fighting on the continent, for very different reasons, generally against the emperor, Lucius, because he wants to be emperor himself. Then because to leave Britain, he entrusts his kingdom to Mordred, his nephew. Bad idea, because Mordred isn't Gawain, and Mordred betrays the king and decides to marry Guinevere, whether she decides it or not. So as you can see on the table, Guinevere is sometimes an accomplice of Mordred. It depends. And when she's not, it's quite frequent that she's negatively depicted, as I said, but I'll come back to that later. So Arthur comes back. There's a big battle, or sometimes several big battles, because you want to have a lot of fun. And then everyone kills each other, basically, and Arthur is mortally wounded after having killed Mordred and won the battle. But there's not much left. So it's, I think we call that a Pyrrhic victory. Why Arthur is away? That's the important question. There are two versions. So as I said, the first one is the chronicle one. He's fighting the emperor. That's what we find in Geoffrey Lyman, the alliterative Mort Arthur. But then the French decide that it's not sassy enough. So we want something more inventive, and with felony and treason and these kind of things, even more treason, and of course adulterous love. So Lancelot and Guinevere, because Lancelot has been invented, so it's quite handy. Lancelot and Guinevere are found together by Gawain, who is another nephew. Arthur has many nephews, and not always for his gain. Guinevere is condemned to be burnt alive to the pyre, but she's rescued by Lancelot, who kills unknowingly Gawain's brothers in the process. And let's say that Gawain is not very happy. So there are different versions, even in this subversion. That is, Gawain is sometimes maddened by wrath and seeks vengeance against Lancelot. That's the French version in the Mort Arthur, and then the Stendhal, Mort Arthur, and Mallory follow that. But Tolkien, quite interestingly, does not follow that. We'll go back to Tolkien more seriously in a minute, I promise. Tolkien does not use that. So it's quite interesting because he's not the only one in which there is this treason of, there's this discovery of the adulterous love between Guinevere and Lancelot. And Gawain's brothers are killed. But with Tolkien, it is not really a problem. I mean, Gawain is not depicted as being particularly unhappy about that. Surprising, but well. So I'll come back to that because I think it's quite important. Generally, Gawain is maddened by wrath, and then he decides to fight against Lancelot. They leave. So Lancelot goes into exile with all his men, and he's followed by Gawain and Arthur and their army, and that's when Mordred decides to betray Arthur. So I hope you're all clear with that, because you'll have to follow what comes. So is it roughly clear for everyone? Okay, excellent. So I can move on to the issue of courtly love and how Tolkien views courtly love. So the answer is quite clear. Not well. It's not. You're not supposed to lie in bed with someone else's wife, which won't surprise, I suppose, a lot of people, given that Tolkien was quite strict on moral issues. Lancelot, as I said, is first and foremost known to be emblematic of courtly love and must be tackled as such. So Tolkien's take on Lancelot is dependent on Tolkien's take on courtly love. And this take seems to be quite influenced by Lewis's definition of it, who enumerates in the Allegory of Love, 4 characteristics of courtly love: humility, courtesy, adultery, religion of love. So I mentioned some of it in speaking about the episode of the cart. Humility, the knight is nothing compared to the lady. The lady is everything. Courtesy, you have to be soft, gentle. It's the exact opposite of the idea that men can do anything and women are good, which was quite common in marriage and these kind of things in some times. Adultery, because obviously marriage in the Middle Ages is not about love, it's a contract. So if you want to have a love relationship, you don't have to find someone else than your wife or your husband. Meaning that for Lewis, and I think we have to agree on that, courtly love always implies adultery. And the two main, the two couples that are the most famous for that, Tristan and Isolde, and Lancelot and Guinevere, are indeed adulterous. The last one is religion of love, and that is a big problem for Tolkien, because religion is not something that you have to, that you can transform into something else. And religion of love is not Christian. So it is a problem, because as you can read behind me, in a letter to his son, Michael Tolkien, a quite interesting letter, given that Tolkien elaborates on his encounter and then love relationship with his wife, Michael Tolkien's mother. Tolkien says, I quote, "Its weakness," so he mentions the idealized love and the courtly love tradition. "Its weakness is, of course, that it began as an artificial courtly game, a way of enjoying love for its own sake, without reference to, and indeed contrary to, matrimony. Its center was not God, but imaginary deities, love and the lady." And that is the end of courtly love for Tolkien, because love should lead to matrimony. We can see that in the few important couples in Tolkien's work. They generally end or tend to end in matrimony and marriage. They can't in that case. So because of that, Tolkien's characterization of Lancelot is from the beginning a negative one, and Guinevere's too, and it's even worse, I have to say. There might be some misogyny in that. He cannot be true, so Lancelot cannot be a true hero because of his fundamental association with adultery. I quote J. Root, who wrote a very interesting article on that question, complexity of love and honor in Tolkien's Full of Arthur. It will be in the bibliography. For Tolkien, Lancelot is the potentially great warrior whose glory is finally dimmed by his personal failure, specifically his adultery. This disapproval of adulterous love is illustrated by the fact that this love turns sour when the two lovers are reunited after Lancelot has saved Guinevere from the pyre. One could think it is enough to strengthen a couple. I mean, he's just fought his friends for her. But it is actually the reverse here, because of several things. Guinevere is a rather negative character, even if she doesn't betray Arthur with Mordred in this version. She's quite selfish and grasping. To give a few examples from the third canto, here is how Guinevere sees Lancelot. "Dear, she loved him, with love unyielding, lady ruthless, fair as fey woman, and fell-minded in the world walking for the woe of men." And there's a quite important comparison between her interest in love, in gold and silver, and in Lancelot. So she has quite a grasping attitude towards Lancelot. And she is associated to Morgan Le Fay, by the use of the word fey woman. Fey comes from fairy, in French, fée, and Morgan Le Fay is Morgane la Fée, so Morgan the Fairy, originally. But Morgan is, the exact opposite of what a woman should be generally in Arthurian novels. In the Matter of Britain, she's malicious, she's evil, and she's, of course, she's a witch. And she's, sexually independent. That's a lot for medieval men, I suppose. Guinevere is already a bit worrying, I'd say, and she's not, this tender Guinevere that we're used to. And indeed, when they reunited after she has been rescued from the pyre, from war she shrank not, might her will conquer life both and love with delight keeping, to wield as she wished while the world lasted, but little liked her lonely exile, or for love to lose her life's splendor. So Guinevere is very happy to be with Lancelot, but she'd like to have her palace back, in Tolkien's version. Their love can't bear daily conjugal life. They're bored. Lancelot and Guinevere have always lived their love in a kind of mystery way, and they had to hide. But now they're together and they're besieged, so they have nothing to do, really. And she wants to live like a queen. He regrets what he did by killing some of his friends, which leads to estrangement. That's the word used by Tolkien. There's a repetition Strange, she deemed him, and a bit later, strange, he deemed her. So they can't recognize each other anymore. And because of that, Lancelot and Guinevere have a rather harsh parting compared to what usually happens. Their love is definitely not approved of, or at least depicted as a positive thing. And one can even, I think, perceive the idea that sin causes unhappiness by itself, without even an external punishment. Only a righteous love, for Tolkien, can be blossoming and happy. And we can see that in the parting of Lancelot and Guinevere, because, they have to. Lancelot accepts because the Pope asked to release, in a way, Guinevere, to let her go back to Arthur, and Arthur has to take back Guinevere, which is not a very nice phrase, I think. In pain that they parted, so it's repeated several times. In sorrow they parted, in pain that they parted, and they part cold and griefless, says also Tolkien in his notes. So we don't have the usual tearing parting of Lancelot and Guinevere, who are still in love. We have a rather cold and weird atmosphere of an end of it sounds like the end of a love affair, and that leaves Lancelot quite unhappy. So, which brings us to the Lancelot cocktail. I won't read it because I think it's too stupid to be read, but you can read it yourselves. Lancelot, because he has abandoned his king for his queen, but has then seen his relationship with his lady wither away, appears to have lost entirely his role as the heroic model, especially compared to Gawain, who leads Arthur's army and is described as daunting the queen from the beginning. So Gawain is clear-sighted. He understands from the beginning that there's something dodgy about Guinevere in Tolkien's version. Lancelot is he's alone in, sorry, I hope you've all had the time to read this very interesting slide. But going to a more interesting one. We have the beginning of the third canto, which is the canto where Lancelot is described. It is the only canto in what we have of the death of Arthur, the fall of Arthur, sorry, where Lancelot appears as and is not only mentioned. Then Lancelot, over leagues of sea in heaving welter from a high window, looked and wandered, alone musing. He looks more like a romantic hero than like a knight, and that is especially so, as I said, compared to Gawain. Arthur and Gawain are always together. Lancelot is alone. There's no mention of his usual companions like Bors, Exeter, or Lionel, and there's a strong opposition between Lancelot and Gawain. It has something to do with the colours, but I won't elaborate on that. It's a very short book to read, so do read it. Tolkien deliberately avoids reusing the pattern of an infuriated Gawain led to a disastrous hatred of Lancelot because of his brother's death. As I said, Gawain's reaction is hardly mentioned by Tolkien. So why does Lancelot stay in exile? Well, obviously because he's been exiled for abducting the queen, which is not something you're supposed to do. But as soon as Arthur learned that Mordred had betrayed him, he is longing for Lancelot, and hopes that Lancelot will come and save him and help him. And Gawain refuses to call for help and to call Lancelot for help because he thinks that Lancelot could be unreliable, that Lancelot has already kind of betrayed Arthur. So that is why Lancelot is on his own, in his kingdom, which is on the continent, not in Britain. And the problem is that Arthur actually has a need for Gawain because Mordred has an enormous army, and Lancelot is the only one that Mordred fears. It is said in Canto 4. The problem is that Lancelot will precisely not act on his own. He's unable to understand that things have changed and to behave like a faction leader, like he does from the moment that he's exiled in the Mort Arthur, the Mont Arthur, the French one, and the stanzaic, and then Mallory. So, as we can see in these extracts, Lancelot is always hesitating. He's considering intervention, but only if he's asked to, which definitely sounds like someone who is still, used to be commanded, not a faction leader. And he doesn't know how to handle this new state of things. He waits for summons, but as the text says, there came neither from king's summons nor word from lady. And because of that, Lancelot stays in France. He's supposed to be in France. When Lancelot sees a chance of rescuing Guinevere like in the good old times, he's eager to do it, like you can see in the extract. That in wrath she left him, if she sent him summons, swift and gladly, etc., he would sail overseas. So Lancelot is perfectly ready to go and save the day again, but only if he's summoned. Which is weird because usually, in Chrétien le Trois, he wouldn't have to be summoned. So he has become unable to act on his own. And he doesn't understand that the world has changed and that he has to be independent. On the contrary, Guinevere has understood that, as she clearly shows that she isn't sure that Lancelot will come, and she hopes he'll come. But she understands that he might not come. And that is probably the main problem for Lancelot. He's unable to understand that the world has changed. This is clearly illustrated by an episode that is Lancelot sleeping and dreaming. That can sound a bit banal to sleep and dream, but it's a quite evocative episode in this context, because dreams, when they're mentioned in the matter of Britain, are generally omens. And, they're always omens, in fact. And when someone is mentioned as dreaming, it will generally lead to a prophecy. If we compare Arthur's dream in The Death of Arthur by Mallory, taken from the French book, we can see that Arthur dreams a wonderful dream. I won't inflict upon you an attempt to read and pronounce Middle English properly, so I'm sorry. What Arthur sees is the quite famous episode of the Wheel of Fortune. That is, he's sitting on the Wheel of Fortune and the wheel is spinning. So at some point, he'll just fall into a pit. That's too early. A pit of full of serpents and worms, which is not probably very nice. And that is, of course, the omen that he will die if he makes battle with Mordred. So Lancelot lies alone, dreaming, his eyes opened, but he doesn't understand a thing. He doesn't understand that the tempest in which he dreamt is an omen, that it is an omen of change, of tempest. I think it's quite clear as a symbol, the tempest. But Lancelot doesn't understand it, and he just sings to himself low and softly, which is, again, quite surprising as a course of action for the best knight in the world. Whereas, on the other hand, we have the king, Arthur, who, as a king, acts as a sensible political leader and as a wise man, aware that dreams and prophecies are not to be taken lightly in this world. And so he tries to get a truce, but the truce will be broken, and it's another story. The fact that Lancelot is unable to understand that the world has changed makes him lonely and puts him in a remote place of the narrative. He is always on his own and does not appear in the other cantos with the other characters. And he'll have no influence on what happens. And we know that because Tolkien, sorry, not Arthur, Tolkien left us a few notes about what should have been the end of the Fool of Arthur. As I said, it's not finished. So it stops after Arthur, at the moment Arthur and Gawain tries to land in Britain. But we have a few notes about what would have followed. And Lancelot decides to travel. On the left, you have the notes about the end and Lancelot's travels. As you can see, Lancelot rides ever west and then sails west. And there's a name that probably will ring a bell, Earendel, which allows us to make, of course, to think of the Silmarillion and the Book of Lost Tales. In his editorial work on his father's poem, Christopher Tolkien gives us to read these rather sparse notes, as I said, and explores their main implications. The most important aspects is, I think, the link it makes between the Isle of Avalon and the Isle of Tol Eressëa, which is Erendel's destination, one of Erendel's destination. And, of course, that happens in the context of Lancelot sailing west. Because, as we can see, the draft mentions Earendel Passage. This Earendel Passage is a short poem, about 16 lines, written by Tolkien. And you have on the right the last lines of this poem. So in the context of Lancelot in an Arthurian world, sailing west emerges Earendel, that is, one of the main heroes in Silmarillion. Arthur, as we know, is supposed to have gone to Avalon after he's been mortally wounded by Mordred. Lancelot is looking for him, but he never comes back. That is specified at the end of Tolkien's notes. He never returns from the sea. Just to remind a few, if necessary, Tol Eressëa is an isle, the Lonely Isle, and it's off the coast of the western continent in Tolkien's world, the continent where elves and deities live. And it is the objective of a lot of travels, mainly Erendel's one, but others, and I will just elaborate on that in a minute. But Tolkien does not only associate Avalon and Tol Eressëa closely in both his drafts. In both his drafts for The Fall of Arthur and for The Lost Road and the first versions of Erendel's story, he makes them similar, using the same geographical description in both contexts. As we can see in these extracts, courtesy of Christopher Tolkien, the Bay of Faery upon the borders of the world is the characterization of Tol Eressëa in Tolkien's geography of Arda, that is, his fictional world. And Earendel goes past the hills of Avalon and to the Bay of Faery on the borders of the world. So we have exactly the same descriptions. I quote Christopher Tolkien: "If this is so, then when my father wrote in a Silmarillion context that Tol Eressëa was renamed Avalon, he also wrote Avalon for Tol Eressëa in an Arthurian context. So in a way, they're the same," which obviously leads to a surprising conclusion that Lancelot is actually living in Tolkien's world, in Arda. All that Arda is the same world as the matter of Britain. And this association is made even stronger by Ariel's story in the Book of Lost Tales, because Ariel is supposed to come from the 5th century Britain, which is exactly the time when Arthur is supposed to have lived. That is, so the Book of Lost Tales has been written much earlier than The Fall of Arthur. The Fall of Arthur is supposed to have been written at the end of the 1920s, the beginning of the 1930s. But the Book of Lost Tales has been written in the late I don't know how to say that, about 1916, 1917. So it's not, the point is not to say that Lancelot and Ariel were meant by Tolkien to be the same character, but that they follow the same pattern and that they match the same idea, that is, sailing west to find a lonely isle where you can learn what has happened for Arthur, but what has happened for Elphinus. That is, it's the purpose of the Book of Lost Tales. It is to tell the stories of the lost tales of Elphinus. So it's we have to remember that Tolkien's Legendarium, exactly like the Matter of Britain, is based on the idea that it doesn't describe another world, but our own world in its ancient times. So Tolkien, by having Lancelot sailing west with an Arundel passage, mixes everything together to create a kind of history of our world where Arda is followed by the Matter of Britain, then by our modern world. But it's not the only thing. There's another narrative which comes from a short poem, very unknown, called Imran, and it's a rewriting from a poem, an Irish poem from the 8th century, and it will surprise you probably, but it was a very popular poem at that time. It's a bestseller, but from the 18th century, the 8th century, not the 18th, sorry. So to get it short, what happens in the original poem, called The Life of Saint Brandan, maybe some of you know it. Saint Brandan, who is an Irish saint, but also a navigator, sails west to find heaven, broadly, and comes back. Tolkien rewrites that in a very short poem, about 130 lines. And he only uses elements that we can find in the Latin text, but he reorganizes them so as to create 2 layers of meaning. A medieval reader could have read the poem and agreed with everything. But at the same time, if we know of the Book of Lost Tales and of the Silmarillion, the 3 main elements of the journey listed by the old Brendan all echo elements of the Great Sea between Middle-earth and Aman, the continent of elves and deities. A cloud, a tree, a star. A cloud associated to a big volcano, basically a volcano. So that refers to Numenor and its volcanic eruption. The tree can be the white tree of Tol Eressëa, taken from the white tree, which is, I think, Telperion. I always mix them up, but Pepe will correct me. The star could be Erendil, who became a star after completing his journey. So we have another sailor going west, Brendan. So we have Lancelot, Ariel or Elfwine, Erendil, Brendan. All these travelers sailing west are different incarnations of the same obsession in Tolkien's work, perfectly summarized by Christopher Tolkien in The Lost Road. With the thought of a time travel story in which the very significant figure of the Anglo-Saxon Elfwine would be both extended into the future, into the 20th century, and extended also into a many-layered past, my father was envisaging a massive and explicit linking of his own legends with those of many other places and times, all concerned with the stories and the dreams of people who dwelt by the coast of the great Western Sea. And I forgot to mention that in his rewriting of St. Brendan, so a saint's life, Tolkien manages, even in a saint's life, to put some elviness. So Brendan has been where dwell the elven kind, always an elf somewhere. All these stories have in common that they introduce us to a character who will remember things and tell them. Stories need to be told, after all. The name of Lost Tales is quite evocative. These tales are precisely not lost. Otherwise, there wouldn't be a book of Lost Tales. Every story needs a narrator, someone who has been part of these events but will survive them to tell them further. And as a matter of fact, Ariel played in earlier versions of the Lost Tales an important part in the stories himself. I might have forgotten to tell that Ariel, that's not the college, or Elfwine, is the man to whom the Lost Tales are told. So he's the frame story. His arrival in Tol Eressëa is the frame story for all the other Lost Tales. So Lancelot in The Fool of Arthur, plays this part of an active witness in two different ways. First, he replaces other characters who embodied the need for remembrance, who assumed the role of witness in other texts regarding the matter of Britain. Both in the Morte Arthur, who comes back from the Grail's quest, to tell about the death of Percival and Galahad, and survives the Morte Arthur. He's one of the only important knights who survive the final battles. He survives everyone at the end of the novel, even Lancelot. Now, Bos is one of the best knights of the Round Table. He's one of the three knights who found the Grail, but he's also a bit set back compared to the main four, Lancelot, Gawain, Percival, and Galahad. Why? I think it is because the character who plays the part of the witness generally needs at least, to be a little away from main events, if only because he would otherwise be taken in the whirlwind of destruction inherent to the death of Arthur's episodes. It's because Bos does not take part to Salisbury battle or Camden battle that he can survive. The same for Lancelot. Lancelot then joins a series of other characters who play this role of witness, eventually of narrator, before leaving this world in a way that is always rather enigmatic. The Hobbit in the Lord of the Rings, who writes the Red Book of the West, then sail west. Brendan, who comes back from his journey to an earthly paradise only to die and go to heaven, that is, go back to where he sailed. And Arundel, who goes from Middle-earth to Aman to tell the gods about what happened, the war against Morgoth, that is, another witness, then experiences a symbolical death and heavenly ascension by becoming a star. This half-death, this disparition into the unknown, is the way to remembrance and persistence. By sailing west, these travelers achieve a kind of immortality, echoing the immortality of the narrative which they've told or witnessed. So, as always with Tolkien, it is quite easy to get lost in a maze of interconnected, moving narratives that rewrite themselves constantly. And I might have get lost at a few moments. What I wanted to show is that through his rather unusual depiction of Lancelot, Tolkien provides a new role for a character that seemed to be frozen in his usual image. Tolkien has little interest in the so-called, by the French, which in his eyes, as I said, is even worse, best knight in the world. He transforms Lancelot into a lonely man, deprived of any energy, lost in a world that he can't understand anymore, deprived of his lady, haunted by the remembrance of things past. But his rather dark depiction allows at the same time Lancelot to become a new figure, the witness of ancient splendor, the remnant of a world that has seen so many great deeds, and finally, the sea wanderer whose endless journey might have brought us tales that would otherwise have been lost. Lancelot disappears, and we'll never know what Tolkien would have written about his journey, which is of course a shame, but I think perhaps a chance to make our own journey and to imagine our own stories about all these lost travelers we've met today. Let's not forget Brendan's last words in Imran. What words beyond this world I heard, if you would seek to know, in a boat then, brother, far afloat, you must labor in the sea, and find for yourself things out of mind. You will learn no more of me.